The gravel popped beneath my tires as I turned off the county road, winding up the familiar trail that led to my grandfather's cabin. The air was different here, crisper, untouched by city fumes or suffocating rules. This was the only place I ever felt grounded, and after 20 years of black ops, federal contracts, and ghost-level field work, I was ready to reclaim it. The cabin stood just as I remembered, timber walls aged with dignity, chimneys still sturdy, and the old swing Grandpa built swaying gently in the wind. A patch of overgrowth had taken the garden, and the porch sagged slightly, but it was mine, inherited fair and square, land that had been in our family before the town had electricity, before this so-called HOA even existed. I killed the engine and stepped out. The scent of pine, wet soil, and old cedar wrapped around me. I closed my eyes and breathed deep. Finally, peace. But peace didn't last long. Across the gravel lane, behind an immaculately trimmed hedge, a curtain snapped shut. Someone had been watching. Moments later, a small white dog began yapping furiously, as if on cue. Then the front door flew open. Out stepped a woman in a stiff blouse, clipboard in one hand, phone in the other. I recognized her from the file I'd reviewed before returning. Karen Metcalf, president of the Hollow Pines Homeowners Association. Multiple complaints, ruthless enforcement, beloved by no one, feared by most. She'd even fined a war widow for having an excessively emotional mailbox. She marched down her front steps like a mall cop with a mission. "Excuse me," she shouted, her voice sharp enough to cut bark. "What are you doing here?" I looked at her calmly. "Unloading. Unloading." Her eyes narrowed at the duffel bag on my shoulder. "This property was reported abandoned. HOA protocol requires prior notification for occupancy. I don't need permission to sleep in my own cabin." She squinted. "And you are?" "Oh no," she smirked. "Of course you are." Her fingers danced over her phone. "If you're lying, sir, you're trespassing on HOA monitored land. I'm calling 911. "Go ahead," I said, walking past her. "They'll need my new address anyway." She hesitated, visibly thrown off by my calmness. But then she raised the phone to her ear and turned her back on me. I didn't bother arguing. People like her fed off resistance. Inside the cabin was dusty but intact. I set my gear down, pulled off my boots, and stretched out on the old cot near the stone fireplace. The silence was rich except for the dog's distant barking and the subtle hum of Karen's indignation vibrating through the trees. It didn't take long. 20 minutes later, flashing red and blue lights cut through the night. I stepped outside as two sheriff's deputies cautiously approached. "Evening, sir," one said. "We got a report of a squatter on private property." I handed him my ID and deed copies without a word. He looked down, read the name, then looked up again. His expression shifted. "You're Morgan Cross." I nodded once. His partner leaned in to look, as in, "Federal Morgan Cross." "Formerly," I said, "now just a man in his cabin." They stepped back. One muttered, "Well, we're good here. No violation." Karen stormed out in a robe and slippers, cheeks redder than her lipstick. Wait, you're not arresting him. This is our jurisdiction." "Ma'am," the deputy said, already turning to leave. "He's the registered owner. He also holds federal clearance above our chain of command. I suggest you reconsider your approach." Karen's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her eyes locked on me, narrowing into slits. "What exactly do you do?" she asked. I smiled faintly, "Less than I used to, more than you'd understand." As the patrol car drove off, she stood frozen in the gravel, fury simmering under her skin. I knew then this wasn't over, but I hadn't come for trouble. I came for quiet. She, however, had just declared war. By morning, the mountain air had barely warmed when I stepped onto the porch and saw the first notice taped dead center on my cabin door, bold red ink across the top. Violation number 001, unapproved dwelling modifications. I blinked at it. Modifications. I hadn't even unpacked a few feet away. A second notice flapped on the mailbox. Violation number 002, non-compliant mail structure. The same wooden box Grandpa had hand-carved in 1973. Overnight, Karen had drawn first blood. I peeled the notices off and dropped them into a metal bucket by the porch. I didn't need to read the rest. I knew this tactic well. It wasn't about rules. It was about control. Karen wanted submission. I wasn't wired for it by the time I brewed coffee and walked the perimeter. 3 more notices had sprouted like weeds: flag placement, gravel driveway width, and one about the improper integration of natural vegetation. Translation: my grass wasn't mowed to her liking. She was testing me hard, but I wouldn't bite. I responded the only way I knew how, with silence. Over the next few days, I kept to myself. Repaired the front step, cleaned out the chimney, replaced the shattered windows the wind had abused. Each task made the cabin feel more like home, and yet each day brought more notices, more passive-aggressive visits. Karen's little dog, Muffin, had apparently been assigned surveillance duty. The mutt barked every time I moved at dawn, noon, and midnight. And every time I glanced at her house across the lane, I saw her silhouette, always watching, always scribbling. Then came the drone. It hovered one morning just above the pine line, blinking silently, capturing footage of me repainting the east wall. I could have ignored it instead. I waved, It zipped away within seconds, but I knew it wouldn't be the last. I also knew enough about FAA drone regs to recognize that she was inching toward a serious federal violation. Still, I gave her rope. At the end of that week, I showed up at the HOA community hall. Karen was hosting a mandatory meeting for all homeowners. The room was full of awkwardly quiet neighbors sipping lukewarm coffee from paper cups, most of them too afraid to speak without her permission. She stood at the podium in a pastel suit that matched her smugness. And now, she announced, we address the issue of unauthorized occupancy on Lot 17B previously assumed abandoned. All heads turned to me. Karen smirked. Mr. Cross, care to explain your situation? I stood slowly. My situation is that I own the land, live on it, and follow the law. What I don't do is bend to arbitrary rules created after my family settled here. Murmurs rustled across the crowd. Someone in the back clapped once before Karen shot them a look. Well, she replied icily, you may claim independence, but this community has standards. Your cabin's structure has not been certified under the HOA's residential compliance codes. If it's not brought into alignment, we may be forced to pursue acquisition through board action. Acquisition, I repeated. You plan to seize private property. She faltered. The bylaws allow for community development in special circumstances. I stepped forward. You should reread those bylaws, Karen, especially the parts about jurisdiction. My land was excluded from HOA governance under a zoning grandfather clause. I've got the deeds, maps, and state-level endorsements to back it up. Her face drained of color, then immediately flushed red. You can't bluff your way through this, she snapped. I don't bluff, I said. I breathed gasps. A few neighbors glanced nervously at each other. Karen's jaw clenched so tight, I thought her teeth might crack. We'll see about that. I nodded. Yes, we will. As I turned to leave, one of the board members, a wiry man in thick glasses, whispered, she's not used to people standing up to her. I looked at him. She need to start getting used to it. That night I noticed 2 more drones buzz over the ridge. This time slower, braver. I jotted something into my notebook and flipped a switch on the side of my porch. The jammers went live. No more surveillance. The war wasn't coming. It had already begun. I spent the next morning combing through Grandpa's old file cabinet, the one hidden beneath a false floorboard in the cabin's pantry. Karen had forced my hand, but she hadn't anticipated the kind of hand I'd play. Within minutes I found exactly what I needed: several thick manila envelopes, yellowed with age, stamped with state seals, county notary signatures, and, most importantly, the one phrase Karen couldn't overwrite, exempt from all HOA oversight under zoning clause. 1 to be revised 1987. I copied everything, scanned, backed up, uploaded to 2 cloud drives and 1 government-protected vault still active from my clearance days. I wasn't going to war with fists, I was going with facts. Midday, I walked down to the county clerk's office and filed a public reaffirmation of my zoning rights. The clerk, an older gentleman with a coffee-stained tie, raised his eyebrows as he skimmed the documents. This land predates the HOA by 30 years, he muttered. Why are they bothering you? I shrugged. Because I don't conform. He laughed. Well, they'll have a tough time rewriting state law. Let them try, I said. I'm just getting started. When I got home, I noticed something odd. My flag was gone. The pole remained, bent and twisted, but the stars and stripes I'd raised the week before had vanished. My stomach sank with cold anger. There was only one person, petty and reckless, enough to do that. Karen. Stealing a flag from a retired federal agent wasn't just disrespectful, it was federal vandalism. Title 18 offense, I called it in. Sheriff sent an officer within the hour. To my surprise, it was Deputy Ramirez, the same one who had responded to the 911 call on my first night. I figured we'd be back here eventually, he muttered, eyeing the pole. Want to press charges? Not yet, I replied, but I want it on record. He nodded, taking pictures. You think she escalates? She already has. The next evening, I returned to the HOA meeting, this time, not as a silent observer. I brought a folder for every board member and one for Karen, triple sealed in plastic and signed in ink. Karen looked annoyed even before I sat down. What is this? She asked, eyeing the folder like it might bite. Clarity, I replied. Documentation proving this land, my cabin and my presence are fully legal. 9 HOA, governed and shielded by both state and federal zoning protections. You keep pushing, you'll be staring down a state lawsuit, a federal complaint, and a very public scandal. Her lips twitched, but she tried to hold her ground. These papers mean nothing to me. We have architectural standards, community bylaws which stop, I interrupted, at the edge of your driveway. I flipped the top sheet in a folder. Map from 2001 zoning line. See that my cabin's outside it. Your board can't fine, inspect, harass, or even comment on what I do. Board members began flipping through the packets. Several frowned. One woman blinked rapidly and whispered, he's right. Karen's smile vanished. I leaned closer. And about the flag, you might want to think long and hard about who took it, because it's on file now. Tampering with U.S. flags on private property is a felony. There's no proof, she snapped. Not yet, I said, rising from my chair. But I have cameras now. so if Muffin so much as sneezes on my lawn, I'll know. The room had turned. The usual hush of fearful compliance was gone. A few members nodded slowly, almost defiantly. Karen noticed it too. Her authority was cracking. On my way out, a man I hadn't spoken to before approached me, tall, grizzled, with oil under his nails. Name's Pete. I live 2 roads over. Karen fined me $600 last year for painting my shed without pre-approval. Thought about selling the place. I looked him in the eye. Don't, he smirked. You've got something planned, don't you? I've got something prepared. I handed him a copy of the zoning map. Pass it around. He tucked it under his arm. Time she learned this ain't a kingdom. That night, I didn't sleep much. Not out of fear but anticipation. Karen had played her game long enough. Tomorrow I'd show her how mine worked. At dawn, the forest felt unusually still. No birdsong, no distant barking from Muffin, just the slow rustle of wind through pine needles and the quiet hum of final moves falling into place. Karen had pushed too far for too long, and her power rested on one brittle foundation: ignorance. She ruled through confusion, intimidation, and red tape. So I did the one thing tyrants never expect. I told the truth, publicly, thoroughly, and with receipts. At precisely 9 a.m., I uploaded a 6-minute video across every local HOA forum and neighborhood group. The video was clean, factual, and devastating. It opened with an aerial map showing the original property zoning. I used Karen's own language from past board meetings against her pulled from recordings. Several brave neighbors had forwarded me. Then I showed the state exemption documents, highlighting each signature and date. And finally, I added the cherry on top, a side-by-side comparison of my cabin's historic deed next to HOA's bylaws, including the exact clause that excluded me from their jurisdiction. The last line of the video was simple: greater than I came here to live in peace. But if you try to rewrite history, threaten veterans, or weaponize the law against innocent residents, then peace ends, and accountability begins. The video spread like wildfire. By lunchtime, I had emails from local property owners, lawyers, even a state zoning official thanking me for clarifying the law. 2 board members resigned before sunset. 3 others contacted me directly, expressing support. But Karen, she wasn't quiet. She stormed onto my property the next day, shaking a crumpled printout of the video transcript. You broadcast private HOA business. That's slander. I stayed seated on my porch. Mug of black coffee in hand. It's all public record, Karen. And truth isn't slander. You're trying to dismantle everything we've built. I tilted my head. You mean the fear the fines? The neighbors who haven't planted flowers in 10 years because they're scared of you. That's not community. That's control. She took a shaky breath. You think you've won. You haven't. You're just a bitter loner with a camera. That's when I stood. No, Karen. I'm a retired federal field officer who spent 20 years removing bad actors from positions of power in foreign governments and domestic ones. Her face froze. I took a step closer. You made one mistake too many when you called 911 on me on my first night home. You tried to make me a trespasser on land my grandfather died protecting. You didn't just cross a line, you erased it. She turned to leave, but I wasn't done, by the way. I added, the sheriff's office has opened a formal investigation into your misuse of drone surveillance, the vandalism of federal flag property, and abuse of power as an HOA officer. Expect a call. She nearly stumbled. The next week, a special HOA election was held. Attendance was at a record high. Karen tried to speak, claimed she was being persecuted, that everything I'd shared was twisted, but the damage was done. The board voted her out in under 5 minutes. Her house went up for sale within the month. She moved quietly, without fanfare. Muffin barked once as the movers loaded the last of her boxes. The silence that followed was deafening and sweet. I stood on my porch watching the U-Haul disappear down the mountain road, a sense of restoration settling over the land. Neighbors began stopping by more often. Some brought baked goods. Others came just to chat. One elderly couple I'd never met before brought a photo of my grandfather standing right here on this porch, flag waving behind him. We're glad someone like you came back, they said. But I hadn't come back to fight. I came back to remember. To rebuild. To preserve. The conflict with Karen hadn't been about rules or buildings or even land. It had been about respect. And when people forget that when power becomes a weapon instead of a duty, sometimes the only answer is to stand firm, not with rage, but with truth. As the sun dipped behind the ridge and painted the treetops gold, I raised a new flag, fresh, bold, unbent, and this time no one dared touch it.